In the first couple generations, you're not going to be seeing many offensive Pokemon that don't have defensive utility insofar as switching into other threats. Now, these offensive Pokemon might have defensive utility that they chase out certain Pokemon just by, in a one-on-one situation, where they out-offense them. You know, like to take a Gen 4 example, Infernape does not switch into anything at all. It's still going to help you check things, because its Mach Punch helps you check DD Tar, Agility Empoleon, SD Lucario. You know, it naturally outspeeds and hits something like Calm Mind Jirachi really hard, right? But it's still not really switching in much. But it's worth it because when Infernape hits the field, it has, you know, the capacity to really blow an enormous hole in the opposing team. And, you know, starting in Gen 4, these types of Pokemon increase in number because of the additions of things like Life Orb and Choice Specs, and just high base power moves in general, like your close combats, you know, even like Rock Slide being upgraded to Stone Edge, things like that, so everything's hitting a little harder, so you can justify that lack of defense in that slot a little more. Whereas, you know, previously, you're not generally going to hit hard enough for this Pokemon to be worthwhile. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, I can't switch into it, and then I can't use this Pokemon to switch into things, and then I use it to hit the field, then I hit the field with it, and then it doesn't do that much damage anyway. So why wouldn't I just use something that does hit decently while also being able to switch into things, right? You know, like an exception would be in Gen 3 Ubers. It's a very common one. Deoxys Attack obviously switches into literally nothing, but it hits so hard that it's worth the effort of getting it on the field, right? But generally, you don't have that type of Pokemon. It's very rare. And that's what makes Heracross so unique in Advance, because it is that type of Pokemon. It is like the truest form of that poke. And this is another thing that distinguishes it from the other fighters, except maybe Medicham. But even Medicham struggles, or can struggle, because, well, due to a number of factors. But the other fighters, yes, they have strong focus punches and whatnot, but they generally are not going to be able to rip through the opposition as easily as Heracross does, and this is due to a number of factors. So, Heracross has Stab Mega Horn. That's really the biggest thing. You know, for the other fighters to be able to hit fighting resistant or immune, in the case of Gengar, and I guess Misdreavus now, in order for them to hit those kinds of Pokemon, they have to use non-stab coverage moves. And even so, like, Blaziken is unique in that, yes, it can Fire Blast, but Blaziken also has a lot of other issues. And Blaziken does not hit that hard with its fighting stab, so it's really more of a fire type that has an easier time breaking through something like Blissey or T-Tar, you know, as opposed to bringing the pain with the fighting type. So even something like Medicham, which, you know, out-damages Heracross by a lot, but it doesn't have that immediate safe stab, you know, whereas, because Medicham, if you get a CB Focus Punch off with it, then sure, great, it's going to evaporate. You know, just yesterday saw it OHKO a Fortress from full health. But that's not a safe, spammable move, you know, and even something like CB Brick Break is not exactly scaring the daylights out of, like, Metagross one-on-one. And same with, like, a Salamence switch-in, you know, or Claydol, you know, God forbid Gengar. And if you start trying to, you know, Rock Slide or Shadow Ball with it, then you're not hitting things as hard. So, you know, even like trying to dance around Celebi, for example, with that, or another example, Breloom, which, you know, tends to just run 3 fighting moves sometimes. You know, so it's all about just being as good as you are at being a fighter. Whereas Heracross's secondary stab in Megahorn, honestly, really, its primary stab, is so good because it eviscerates psychic types, first of all. So, you know, that whole Celebi, Claydol thing is like, not a chance. And second of all, it is a strong stab that is consistent. Like, yes, Focus Punch Heracross obviously hits harder, but you can't just start spamming Focus Punch with Heracross against everything. That's the most easily disruptive thing ever. Whereas Megahorn, you know, Megahorn is as strong as Close Combat is in later generations. So it is that very, very rare attack in Advanced OU, which very few Pokemon like truly resist it. Like Skarmory is obviously the biggest one. You pair it with Magneton, or you threaten it with CB Focus Punch or whatever. But like once Skarmory is no longer in the picture, you just Mega Horn your way through nearly everything else just through sheer brute force. And that is what makes Heracross such a unique Pokemon. And it's what lets it compensate for its complete lack of a defensive profile. It's funny because Heracross is not a frail Pokemon. Its typing is actually not the worst, but it's not, like, it does have very good special defense, but it doesn't have the resists it needs to really find its way in on anything. The most Heracross really switches into is Blissey, and even then it doesn't love doing that particularly because it doesn't have a huge HP stat, so Seismic Toss actually chunks into it pretty nastily. So again, it's that kind of Infernape situation where you really have to kind of go out of your way to get Heracross in safely. I mean, the easy way to do this is just to pair it with Baton Pass Zapdos, because BP Zap is going to bait in things like Blissey, Celebi, Claydol, sometimes defensive Jirachi, but defensive Jirachi in and of itself is not a great answer. So, Flygon, Regice, and then you BP out of those into Heracross, and it's like, oh, well, this is going to be fun. So, yeah, Heracross is so good. To circle back to the fighting thing for a second, Heracross, on some sets, doesn't even run a fighting move, because it's all about Mega Horn. It's just Mega Horn, Rock Slide, and then Sub and SD on the Salic set with Swarm. And of course, that's another wonderful thing about Heracross, is that it makes itself even stronger with both its abilities. With Guts, you burn it. I mean, the whole problem with Heracross is that it's so poor in longevity. It's got Sand and Spike's weakness, and it's not very bulky, and it doesn't resist much of anything. If it had like an Earthquake immunity or something, then it'd be insane. But just resisting it, not really, because it's also doesn't have a great defense stat either. But the whole point of Hera is that, yes, it's not going to have a lot of longevity, but it is going to be the kind of Pokemon that gets a ton of damage off before it goes down. And that is exceedingly rare in Gen 3 without exploding, which obviously is even riskier, or, locking yourself into a risky move like CB Mash from Metagross. And the reason I say CB Mash is risky is that it can get picked off by Magneton very easily. Heracross also has the Dugtrio problem, obviously. But yeah, with Guts, then, I mean, it becomes even stronger. And if it's sub-Salic, then it goes into Swarm range, and its Mega Horn just gets powered up to unbelievable levels. So, yeah, that's what is so interesting about Hera, is that a lot of the time the physical offense teams you find Hera on, and even the ones that don't have Hera, then they have the issue of being very boom or bust, and naturally against the metagame they tend to fall a little more on the bust side, just because they don't have the power. Like, you can say, oh, well, I'll sacrifice my Salamence to weaken the Swampert, and then my T-Tar will sweep. It's like, no, your T-Tar will not sweep. I know it's T-Tar and everything, but it doesn't hit that hard to break through things like this. You really need a lot of extraneous support. Or, it's like, oh, well, I just lost my Metagross to a Dugtrio, but it's fine because I'm going to set up my DD Ments. And it's like, unless your opponent is running a very frail team, or they're basically on death's door as is, then you are basically only looking for a Pokemon there to close the door, not one to blow it wide open. So if you are behind with that kind of team, the only way you are really bringing it back is with luck. Like if you start Rock Sliding, flinching everything in sight. And that's where Heracross's power comes in, because when Heracross shows up on such teams, then, I mean, these teams are going to have the same issues. It's like, oh, there's no longevity at all, and that's bad because your offense is not, at the start anyway, your offense is not going to be enough to it's not strong enough and it's not fast enough. You're going to be outsped by things, and you're going to have to take their attacks. And when you're running a bunch of offensive Pokemon together, you are not going to be able to take their attacks very well, more than once. And whereas in a newer generation, you'd be like, oh, all you need is to take it once, because then you fire back with these insanely high-powered Pokemon that make Advanced Ubers look like an NU tier in comparison. But in Advance, you don't have those tools generally. So you are less able to, to compensate for that back foot period which you're on most of the game. Either everything rolls smoothly, you made the right team choice, and you just bowl over them, but that's often not going to be the case against a competent team made by or used by a competent player, and you are instead just going to be struggling. It's just an uphill battle so much more often than not. So you have that issue of, oh, I can't switch into status, offense, and then you can't finish it off. Heracross is the Pokemon that makes those early game struggles worth it, because you just have to do a couple things for it, and you get rid of the Scarm, and you chunk something like a Salamence or Gengar, Pokemon that are tasked with switching in a lot, and then you just send Heracross in, and it is that outspeed everything and OHKO everything machine that you want in that situation. It's one of the best comeback Pokemon in the tier. Yes, it has a million issues. Sand is everywhere, and it subs down to low range. I mean, that's easy to play around. And it's often its own worst enemy because Megahorn does not have good accuracy. Or it doesn't have bad accuracy, but when you have to chain multiple Megahorns together to win, that is an ugly proposition. But it's also, the ceiling is so high. It has one of the highest maybe, I'm not going to make a definitive statement either way, but you could make a good case. You could argue for it having the highest ceiling in Advance, because nothing else brings games back like this. The only other thing that's comparable is like Calm Mind, Rest Suicune against a team that can't hurt it, but that's that doesn't have the sheer force of Hera, where sometimes you'll just like SD, you'll sub and SD down to Salic and Swarm, and suddenly you're OHKOing Metagrosses with Megahorn. Insane stuff like that. So that's Heracross's place. Lack of defensive utility, but it is so strong and has just the right toolkit. Because Medicham, for example, could not pull off those comeback moves that Heracross can. It can't sub down to Salic and then start ripping through everything, because it doesn't have that Swarm Megahorn. It doesn't boost. I mean, its boosting option is Bulk Up. So. And it's slower even, and and frailer, and just, yeah. So Heracross's Stab Megahorn in conjunction with, its great abilities, just makes it worth the effort. Not consistently, obviously. Heracross is not the poster Pokemon of Advance for reliably winning games, game in and game out. It's the opposite of Skarmory. Skarmory you use every game for the rest of your life, and you'll still do fine, just because of how good it is. As long as you're, conscientious of it, obviously. You can't just, thud into, anti-Skarm teams easily. But it's hard to make a good anti-Skarm team, that's the point. So maybe that's a little exaggerated with every team for the rest of your life. Maybe Tyranitar is probably a better example of that. Actually, definitely Tyranitar, because Tyranitar can do a lot more things than Skarmory. Whereas Heracross, you can't spam game in, game out, but there's nothing scarier than an unexpected Heracross against a team that can't handle it. Because the fact that Heracross is a less consistent Pokemon overall than something like Salamence, even though it's a bigger offensive threat, does lead some players to cheat on it in the team builder. When they're trying to make unbreakable stall teams, it's like, oh, usually I would need, some speed, some sand, whatever. But I don't think the opponent is going to bring Heracross, so I'm just going to cheat and make the slowest, bulkiest, a set of walls that the game has ever seen. And then Heracross shows up, and Heracross makes you, rue that decision more than anything else in the tier. I mean, it just bowls over slow stuff like absolutely nothing. Like, arguably even better than Medicham, because, like, you can say, oh, well, Weezing can stop Medicham. It's like, yeah, and Weezing does not stop Heracross nearly as well. You can't even burn it. And it SDs and just runs out of control so fast. And, like, even something simple like SD Lefties Heracross, when people say, oh, well, Heracross gets worn down, what if I put leftovers on it? A lot of these teams suddenly become so much worse against it because they're so used to it basically dying slowly just by existing. And now you slap on leftovers and you can't just protect on it a million times. Like, oh, I actually have to hit it directly. And with a slow, bulky team, you're not able to hit it directly and hit it reliably. So, because it's going to eviscerate you first. So, yeah, there's a... Yeah. There are a lot of pray my opponent doesn't bring Heracross teams out there. And, I think they're bad, but... Yeah, there's nothing... For all of Heracross's flaws, it is never left wanting for power. It's able to, rip its way through pretty much everything with the right set and the right playing. So, again, it demands a lot of the player, but the rewards are just enormous. Now, Gyarados is interesting because it is... I don't want to say the opposite of Heracross, because that's not really a perfectly accurate comparison, but Gyarados is left wanting for power a lot. And you know that whole thing about Heracross will always have Mega Horn because it's just such a perfect stab? Well, Gyarados does not have that. Gyarados' stab is HP Flying, and sometimes it doesn't even run that because it wants to run HP Rock or HP Ghost. So it's tough to make that work. What Gyarados is very good at is it has amazing defensive typing and water flying. Now, it is not a true bulky water in this sense, because it is weak to rock, so you can't use it as your quote-unquote Tyranitar or Aerodactyl check. Obviously, it can help pivot around them because Intimidate and EQ immunity and Spike's immunity is just wonderful. Fighting resistance, Gyara has an interesting relationship with Hera, because they're often teammates on physical offense, or not often, sometimes teammates on physical offense. And Gyara is one of the better checks to it because it resists both stabs and has Intimidate. I mean, it still takes Rock Slide pretty heftily, same like Salamence, but it's a good way to help play around Hera more consistently. Because a lot of the time, people's answer to Heracross is Gengar, which can't even really hurt it in return. So you just wind up mowing your way through Gengar. And it's like, oh, well, Gengar's down. Now my DD Mence or whatever is going to be scarier. How awesome is that? So, yeah, Gyara is interesting because it's also inconsistent like Hera. Like, you can't chuck it on the field. But the reason it's inconsistent is that a lot of what it depends on, or a lot of how it's going to do in that game is dependent on its moveset. Because let's take its classic moveset, right? Adamant, DD, HP Flying, EQ, and then Double Edge or Taunt. So, without Taunt, you are going to get ruined by things like Toxic Milotic, or something as simple as that, or Swampert, or, Thunderwave Blissey. But without Double Edge, you are completely walled by Zapdos. And, okay, not to say that these are, like, issues that you can't overcome with smart team building and smart play, but they are... The reason why Gyara has so many problems is that it has that many problems. It's not that it just has one problem it has to fix, is that it has a lot of problems it's going to be facing often at the same time, on the same team, in the same battle. It's like, oh, well, I have a Taunt Gyarados, so I can stop that Toxic Swampert and that T-Wave Blissey, but they also have a Zapdos. Oh, and even if you say, oh, well, I'll lure in and destroy the Zapdos with something like a Metagross, it's like, oh, well, they also have a Gengar, which lives +1 HP flying, and, oh, they also have an Aerodactyl. Even let's just assume that Skarmory's out of the picture. Oh, or they also have an Aerodactyl, which just completely walls Gyarados. Like, Aerodactyl is another Heracross-esque Pokemon, in that it doesn't have an amazing defensive profile, but actually, the more you think about it, as Advance goes on, it's like, this thing actually is a great Charizard answer. So, like, and it uses its speed to check things. It's got great longevity, too. Whereas, and one of the best things about Aero's defensive profile is that standard, like, stabs Gyarados is actually walled by it, and Adamant Gyarados, and it does really want to be Adamant because it has power issues as is, even with max attack. And with Adamant, you don't even outspeed Aerodactyl after a Dragon Dance, or Jolteon for that matter. But Aerodactyl is the more imposing, relevant presence in the tier. So, yeah, and as soon as you go Jolly, then yes, you are going to outspeed Aero and Jolt, and that's great, fantastic. But the power issues... Oh, and if you do run Jolly, you are pretty much obligated to run HP Rock, which, is cool because then you actually hit Aero, because it's like, oh, well, what's the point of outspeeding Aero if you can't KO it, right? So, You have HP Rock for that, great. You hit something like Salamence harder one-on-one, great. You actually hit Zapdos very hard after a boost, wonderful. Now you don't have Stab, and you are not going to be able to threaten something you should be hitting super effectively with your Stab, like Celebi. You know, Double Edge is not nearly as threatening. Oh, and, I mean, Double Edge being your strongest move against neutral targets like Suicune and Claydol is also fine, but it cuts into what Gyarados' good traits are. So, and those are, it's got great special bulk and great typing. So, the thing is, though, that Gyarados, because of these traits, is not your average D-Deer like Salamence or Tyranitar, or your average physical attacker like Metagross or Aerodactyl. And this is a category it shares with Heracross, in that Gyara is a physical attacker not afraid of water types. You know, if you want to try and check Heracross with your Suicune, then, you know, go nuts. The Heracross user would be very happy. You know, same with Gyarados. They very rarely will pack coverage for it, so you are able to. You're not afraid of Ice Beam. You're not afraid of Surf. You know, with Taunt, then you're not afraid of Toxic or Roar. But that's where it gets a little complicated. I've also experimented with a sub in that last slot because it stops Toxic. It doesn't stop Roar, obviously, but it stops Toxic, and it also blocks explosions from things like Metagross and Snorlax, which would otherwise take a hit from you. Because, again, Gyarados, power issues. So it's like that earlier Salamence example, where you really just want that lockdown late game, where you outspeed and have the little bit of a boost, and then you cut through everything, right? But it can be very nasty in those scenarios, because this is not just to rip on Gyarados' flaws. Yes, there are many. This is why it is an inconsistent Pokemon. But it is also a potentially really nasty Pokemon late game, really when the opponent's team is softened up. And that's actually kind of the paradox, that Gyarados is such a great defensive presence. Like, it's a pretty good switch into Salamence, for example. But when you have to preserve it for the late game, then, you know, you've got that 5v6 scenario, and it doesn't have the power, or, you know, even the coverage sometimes. Like, it's like, oh, well, it's HP Rock for the arrow. It's like, oh, well, there's a Gengar there, which practically full walls you now. You know, you gotta pair it with Magneton and Pursuit T-Tar, and then you also have to weaken on other million things, and you still wind up, like, getting trashed by, like, Celebi. But HP Ghost at least hits Gengar and Celebi as well, and Claydol even. So HP Ghost is actually a very underrated option. But yeah, so the good traits of Gyara are its longevity because of Spike's immunity, and its Intimidate, obviously, and it is not afraid of waters, right? So that can put opponents in really uncomfortable positions late game when you are trying to stop his DD sweep. You know, even as a nice Meteor Mash resist. Problem is, you can't use these early in the game while still having Gyara pose a threat late game, right? Because it doesn't heal in sand. So what you got to do is play that 5v6 early on, and then hopefully your specific Gyara will be able to beat what the opponent has left. And even then, you will wind up like not KOing a Jirachi with +1 EQ, and it thunderbolts you back. You know, stupid stuff like that. But, so this is why, the point I was trying to get to is that a lot of lately players have really, HP Ghost also smacks Starmie. That's a huge one, actually. So something like that in this scenario would be horrifying for the opponent against the Gyara. So see, that's why Gyara is also a Heracross-esque Pokemon, in that it can very easily just thud into nothing. Kind of like Heracross will never thud into nothing, but it just gets worn down in 2 seconds and winds up not living up to its destructive potential. Whereas Gyarados can thud into nothing, or it can use its unique talents, because, again, it is also overlooked because it's not that strong, and, you know, and it doesn't have, you know, good stab at all. I mean, Salamence makes up for its reliance on HP flying as stab with the fact that it has one of the highest attack stats in the tier. You know, whereas Gyarados is a good attack stat, not good enough for what its move pool is. So yeah, you wind up not being able to get the most out of Gyarados as a D-Deer, but sometimes you will have that matchup where Gyarados is just the perfect thing. And Salamence could never dream of, you know, setting up and all over, you know, Milo Blissey, Celebi stuff the way that a Taunt Gyara might. However, some players are like, hey, I want to use my Gyara in a more consistent way. I don't want to have it hang back in the late game until the late game and then have it not do anything anyway, which is very likely because so many things naturally give Gyarados grief, right? Including Gyarados itself because of its lack of power. So how do I use Gyarados more? Well, if you've been watching the replays in this video, and if not, you're not really missing out on anything. This is a good listening video. Then there have been some players experimenting with choice band Gyara. I heard tell of CB Gyara as far back as 2014, I think, or no, maybe even earlier, but 2012, 2013, where a guy named Nails was experimenting with it, and it was pretty cool. I think M Dragon had some use for it, and then a few years ago, Astamatidos wowed the world when he brought CB Gyara to several tournament games and really ripped through it. And then, this year we saw Ban Manaphy, or Mana, bring CB Gyara to a unique effect in the lead slot with HP fighting. So, those kinds of... That's a very interesting way of using Gyara. Well, before I get to that, because I do think CB is the best way to use Gyara, but the other way that players have tried to use Gyara is to dip into its utility move pool more, because it's got Thunder Wave. If you can use DDT Wave and kind of have your cake and eat it too, in that, okay, if I preserve my Gyara for late game, fine, great, and I can sweep with it. If I don't think that's going to be the case, and this does require the player to really be on point and be analyzing the opponent's team and figuring out when, is Gyara going to be useful against this late or not, yes or no. And if not, then you bring your Gyara in early on and you start T-Waving some stuff. And I mean, if you T-Wave a Zapdos or an Arrow, you T-Wave an Arrow or a Gengar, then that's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Just so you don't have that awful feeling of, oh, well, I DD'd late game and then T-Tar lived my EQ easily and rock slided me into dust. So DDT Wave is cool, but Gyara also has Taunt. So some players have experimented with things like T-Wave Taunt, sometimes even Toxic for things like ground types trying to absorb it. Very silly stuff, but the whole point is that Gyara does not have an immediately threatening move pool, and you have to really get like funky with it and I know that puts some funny mental images in some of your minds, so feel free to run wild with that. But you really do, because it's not going to be threatening things with power. You're going to have to use that good defensive typing to make the most of its utility move pool. So there hasn't been a good, and the reason why I'm going over this before I spend more time on the CB set is that there isn't really a good set, or definitive set I should say, that has been figured out as, oh, this should be the standard because it does all these things for defensive Gyara. Some players have experimented with like Roar, and like it's definitely cool, but nothing that has really been found to fit consistently on certain kinds of structures, because it also doesn't heal. And yeah, it has great synergy with Wish Jirachi obviously, but and some players have used like Gyara Steelix on offensive teams, but it's like UD's old team, which had DD Rest Gyara to completely shut down anything with Toxic. And like DD Rest Gyara, very cool. Suddenly you're not afraid of Moltres ruining you with Will-O-Wisp as you set up. But it's also so specific. And I mean, Rest. I mean, talk about giving the opponent free turns, and that's a really hard thing to overcome. But yeah, utility Gyara. If you can actually switch it in, and that's why I like CB so much, because it switches in more immediately. And yeah, it's gonna have more longevity problems because sand and whatnot. But you're able to switch it into things like Mix Fence or whatever, because you absorb Brick Break like nothing, and then you actually respond. Like, let's say you switch your average DD Gyara, like your HP Flying, EQ, Double Edge thing, into a Mix Fence, right? On a Fire Blast or a Brick Break, and it's like, are you really threatening the Salamence in return? That's the whole point. Because you need a DD to be threatening, and it can just Dragon Claw you twice if it wants. Switch to a counter that you're not threatening immediately. It's really not a good check to that Salamence, because you are not really putting it on the back foot. You just temporarily inconvenienced it. Best case, you draw a Dragon Claw to pivot into something else, like your Ice Punch Jirachi, so you avoid getting Fire Blasted on the switch. Something like that, right? But with T-Wave Gyara, that's why the utility set is like, oh, well, now my Gyara switched into this Mence, and it immediately forces that Mence out, because if that Mence gets T-Waved, it's ruined. If that Mence gets, DD'd on, or HP Flying, or Double Edge, it's like, okay, that's cool, that just means the Gyara took more damage, and eventually my Mixed Mets is going to run them over, right? And with CB, you have a similar dynamic, except you have a more robust move pool against the greater metagame as a whole, because you are hitting everything for at least decent damage, with good prediction, obviously. But... and you don't need to run HP fighting like Mana did. Obviously, that lets you be a good lead into T-Tar, of course, and it lets you threaten Blissey wonderfully, which is really good. If you can get that out of Gyara, then that's fantastic. You know, and even something like Snorlax. But you can run HP flying. I don't know if you'd run HP Ghost, but, you know, HP flying is just good for stab. You know, have a hard-hitting move that isn't double edge and isn't ripping into you with recoil. And what's cool about Gyara is CB Gyara, another cool thing rather, is not just that you use its typing and you are immediately an offensive threat, so you can more support. You can use it on an offensive team and have a Pokemon that's actually offensively threatening, which sounds like a wild concept, I know, but in advance with the low power level, that is exactly what you need, you know, sometimes to do things like this. So you run HP Flying, or, you know, Fighting, or Rock, or Ghost, or whatever. Yeah, I think it would be one of those. I don't think you would run HP Bug Gyara. As funny as that would be, honestly, HP Bug, it doesn't even sound bad, to be perfectly frank with you. But you can, I would probably run some of the others though. But yeah, you run that, and you run Earthquake, obviously, and then Double Edge, and then what's your last moveset? I think T-Wave is also a great option on CB Gyara, because, you know, the slower walls, then you can batter away at them repeatedly, and in faster games where it's like, oh, well, I don't know if I want to, you know, HP Flying this or Earthquake that, and it's like, oh, I'm going to use T-Wave and catch either the Jirachi or the Aerodactyl or the Gengar or the Zapdos, you know, and then it's funny because when you T-Wave something with CB Gyara, then you switch out, you come back in, and you have supported your own CB Gyara threat by slowing down the opposing Pokemon first. So you can do T-Wave. I think some players ran Roar just to have some security against things like Calm Mind Suicune, which, you know, that's a great option too, especially if you pair it with Spikes. I think I experimented with CB Gyara a few years ago, and just like use it like a CB Salamence on like Scar Mag kind of stuff. You know, there's lots of options. So I think CB really helps bring out the best of Gyara's potential, because that typing is so good. Not being afraid of water is just so nice. And if you... and actually giving it immediate power really lends it another, some more depth to its game. You know, and if you have a Scar Mag team, you can support it with Wish Blissey, so you can, you know, CB Gyara at them over and over and over. So, yeah. And, of course, you have that great synergy between them because it absorbs fighting moves, or ground moves aimed at Jirachi, or fire moves aimed at Jirachi. So, yeah. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to say, I think. So thank you so much for watching / listening. Let me know your thoughts on Heracross and Gyara in advance. And I will see you in the next one.